And I think we're going to hear much more about what I think of as the Glasgow model and how it's being renewed once again under new leadership and with a fresh approach to the current moment. Stuart has already introduced the agenda, so I won't say any more about that. Suffice to say that many of you will know that when it comes to question time, I have a habit of just picking on people and asking them what they're thinking and to share their thoughts. So please be ready. It could be you. And with that, I'd like really to begin the conference proper. And it's a great honour for me, and I'm sure for all of us, for me to be able to welcome our first speaker, the leader of the City of Glasgow. Please welcome Councillor Gordon Matheson.
Friends, as we survey our economy, one of the things that must give us heart is that Glasgow is still attracting quality jobs.
Stuart, in his introductions, said that we would next talk about the role of Glasgow in contributing to national economic success and national economic growth in Scotland. And to introduce that subject and to take the debate forward with you, please welcome, if you will, Paul Lewis, who's the Managing Director of Operations for Scottish Enterprise.
The Commission, I hope, has got a very important and powerful role, really to set a new direction for Glasgow for the next phase of its economic growth, one where we can really identify the distinctive assets this city and its wider region will bring to deliver the next phase of economic growth for Glasgow and therefore also for Scotland.
We're now going to take the temperature from the business community here in Glasgow, and no better person to do that is the person who has already introduced the conference to you today, the Chief Executive of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. Please welcome Stuart Patrick.
I want to give a short summary of what we already know about the impact of the recession on the city, highlight a few of the genuine bright spots that we can build on to get some of the momentum going in our recovery, and say a bit more about how we might best respond to meet our aspirations.
He talked about the temptation, as it were, for members of the Chamber of Commerce to wave their shrouds and to potentially complain. But actually, he then went on to give you, I think, a very active definition of what urban resilience looks like. And he talked about the companies and the entrepreneurs that are thriving. He talked about the export markets and the global penetration that your companies are receiving. And he talked about the rich mix now of sectors that the Glasgow economy is, and really showed how, building upon past experience, economic resilience is now something that is part of the city's fabric. We've heard about, from the leader, we've heard about the new Glasgow Jobs Fund. We've heard about the new extended Commonwealth Apprenticeships programme. We've heard from Stuart Patrick about the Economic Commission. And I think that what we've seen is the recognition of challenge, but at the same time, a new focus on ambition and also precision in the way the city economies is going to move forward in terms of job creation and job growth and support for economic inclusion, in terms of companies and sectors and export markets, and then lastly in terms of infrastructure and investment. We're grateful that we're able to continue our conference exactly on time, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce your keynote speaker for the morning. Many people know or have seen recently in the media Will Hutton. Will is the Executive Vice Chairman of the Work Foundation. He's also been one of the leading commentators on the recent economic and financial crisis and its aftermath. Many of you know that Will is one of the established intellectual leaders on the progressive side in our country, a former economics editor of The Guardian, editor of The Observer. He's now working, as many people know, for the government, leading a Fair Pay Commission, whose first report, its interim report, will be published on December the 1st. He's also, as many of you know, an award-winning and celebrated author. His latest book, Them and Us, is out now in the bookstores, and this deals with the whole issue of economic fairness and the idea of a good capitalism. Please will you join me in welcoming Will Hutton.
Fiscal policy is going to matter, but what's going to matter more is how smart you are in building the institutions up, the anchor institutions as I call them, that will anchor private and public sector entrepreneurship, private and public sector investment.
and to talk to us about the energy sector and its potential for Glasgow and for central Scotland. Please will you welcome Frank Mitchell, who's the Director for Energy Networks at Scottish Power.
Stuart Party asked me to review where Glasgow was, but with a corporate eye. And so I'm going to try and share with you some analysis that I've done, standing off, looking at it as somebody who works in the corporate sector.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. Paul Lewis earlier on spoke about the potential of green energy, and Will Hutton talked about the ecosystem that's required. I think Frank has just given us a brilliant description of how that ecosystem is coming together. Colleagues, we go immediately to our question time. Those of you who've been to this conference before will know that we take multiple contributions at once. There are 3 things that might happen. I've got 26 pre-submitted questions here in my hand. Some of them have names attached to them, some of them are anonymous. You may simply ask questions or make points yourself spontaneously, and of course panellists, you can make points to each other or respond to something else that's already been said. But let me start with a couple of the questions that have been pre-submitted while you get your juices flowing, as it were. So one question that's been asked is really about knowledge economy and enterprise. I picked this up because it might be something for Will Hutton to think about. But there's a question that's come in that says, Glasgow appears to have the conditions for knowledge creation, but do we have the conditions for enterprise creation? And are the 2 things different? So there's one question. Now, is Barbara Graham here? Where's Barbara? If you raise your hand, microphone will come to you.
My question is this, and it would appear that a central theme of our economic strategy as a country is to rebalance the resources and staffing invested in the public and private sector.
An excellent question. Thank you very much. Panellists, we'll take about 5 or 6 questions, and I'll invite you just to comment on the 1 or 2 that you find most interesting. Is Ruth Webber here, please? Where's Ruth? If you can keep your hand up, the microphone will come to you. Ruth, it's your turn to ask the question. Please stand up when you give your question, if you would.
It may not be the question that you have on your sheet, because I can't remember what that was.
Changed your mind.
But I have another question.
Good.
It's about the Economic Commission, and I just wonder, given that it's looking for the next 5 years in terms of priorities, how quickly can that be enacted?
My question is something which was only marginally touched on today, but not specifically, and that is the issue of high-speed rail, and what role high-speed rail can play.
Very much, Councillor. Is Alan McLean here from Virgin Trains? Alan, you had a question that is somewhat related to the one we've just heard, so why don't you ask that now?
My question was how important to Glasgow's future economy are faster, more frequent and higher capacity trains from and to London and other English cities?
Why don't you just take 15 or 20 seconds to tell us what Virgin's ideas are about that?
Well, basically, in a nutshell, there are 3 gaps in an otherwise hourly timetable from London Euston to Glasgow Central. We want to plug those gaps. We want to plug them for some considerable time.
Thank you very much indeed. And I can tell you, colleagues, that there's 4 or 5 other questions on this theme that were submitted, including whether the panel would like to comment on whether Glasgow faces insuperable problems of peripherality or lack of connectivity. So, colleagues, we've had questions there about the Economic Commission, the public-private split, knowledge creation versus enterprise creation, high-speed rail, better trains, peripherality, housing issues. Why don't you pick those up first? Councillor Matheson.
I'll touch on a couple. High-speed rail. I'm delighted that Councillor Watson raised that point.
Leader, thank you very much indeed. Let's go immediately, if we may, to Mark Logan from Glasgow Housing. Mark, your perspective. There are a couple of questions particularly focused at you. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. So we then had a range of questions about the ability of the private sector to pick up from the public sector, knowledge creation, enterprise creation, connectivity issues more generally. Will, could you pick up some of those points for us?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a big debate in America about the, which is a great private sector job generator, but it's taken, in all the recoveries, since the 70s, it's been taking longer and longer and longer for the private sector in the United States to create the jobs that were lost in the recession. You've got to play both tunes, public sector as employer of last resort, and drive private sector entrepreneurship.
Thanks very much, Will. Paul, can I ask you to pick up the question about whether we have the system for knowledge creation, but do we have a system for enterprise creation?
On knowledge creation and entrepreneurship, I mean, I think your question implies, quite rightly, Scotland's a great inventive country. You know, we really do punch above our weight in terms of the kind of quality of invention. We have, I believe, underperformed on the exploitation of those ideas for the economy. And if you think about what's needed for successful exploitation, you need the idea, we have those. You need the money, the risk capital around that. You need great entrepreneurs. And I think you need to really understand the markets you're playing into.
Thank you very much, Paul. Frank, you did talk about being world-class in something that the world actually really wants and really needs. I guess the questions that have come out in the last session are, firstly, do you have the ecosystem around you to make that happen in Glasgow? And secondly, does connectivity matter to you in that quest of making Glasgow that world-class hub of energy?
I don't think we've quite got the ecosystem in place yet. I think there's work to do, but I think we are in a much better position than sometimes we may think we are. On connectivity, I think the movement of labour is something that every industry needs, and bringing the best people and making sure they can come and help you wherever you are.
I just want to say one thing.
Yes, please.
I hope the Commission does some serious mapping of what the Glasgow and Central Belt innovation and investment ecosystem is, where the gaps are, and what initiatives can be taken to close those gaps.
Stuart, you are involved in many of the things that have been raised. I suppose the Chamber of Commerce has an opinion on high-speed rail, and I suppose you have a view about what the Economic Commission will do and about the scope for the private sector to pick up from the public sector. So let's have your view, if we may.
The very fact that you can hardly get on a train from London to Glasgow on a Friday or a Sunday, how are we going to build our city break tourism market if you can't get on a train at the times most people want to? And how difficult is it to add an extra couple of carriages now? Why do we have to go through a whole franchising process that will take years, well, months?
I think the point you're making, Stuart, is you're determined not to get caught up in those slow processes, yeah?
I guess that's true, yes.
Yeah. Great. Colleagues, let's open it up again. We've probably got chance for another round. This is the time to make your questions. There's a lady there with her hand up. Gentleman here with a white piece of paper. If you get the microphones to them, that would be good. There's three actually here. So you're first, madam. I'd like to turn now to the leader. Gordon, your reflections and your conclusions, if you will. These will be the last formal comments before we wrap up the conference.
I think this has been an appropriately upbeat conference, so I'm very grateful to all who have spoken.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Councillor Matheson. I'm going to close the conference now, and the way I'm going to do this is by firstly inviting Stuart Patrick to come and join me here at the podium, and secondly inviting you on our behalf, before we make our concluding remarks, to thank all of the panellists, Councillor Matheson, Will Hutton, Mark Logan, Paul Lewis, Frank Mitchell, and of course Stuart Patrick himself. Thank you to the panellists. Firstly, I think that you've heard quite a lot about not just resilience, but also the new potential of the city and the potential in the new environment. Despite its challenges, there's a big opportunity here. You've heard something about an agenda which seems to me to have even more precision in it than usually. There are very key interventions that are being proposed to support jobs and economic inclusion, to support the knowledge economy, to build the ecosystem, to create the right kinds of connectivity. The agenda here is more precise, more specific, more focused, more evidence-based than in many of the cities I visit around the world. It's very clear that you know what needs to be done. To close the conference, please, Stuart Patrick.